Welcome to the Strange History Podcast, where we explore the weird and the wonderful history that has shaped the world into what it is today. Strange History is proudly part of the Darkcast Podcast Network, hosted on Spreaker. Go check out all the amazing podcasts there. This episode is about a dark part of history that had good intentions: poorhouses. Poorhouses were tax-supported residential institutions in which people were required to go if they could not support themselves. They were started as a method of providing a less expensive alternative to what we would now call welfare. They called it outdoor relief. People requested help from the community overseer of the poor, sometimes called a poor master. This person would be an elected town official. If the need was great or likely to be long-term, they were sent to the poorhouse instead of being given relief while they continued to live independently. Sometimes they were sent there even if they had not requested help from the overseer of the poor. That was usually done when they were found guilty of begging in public. Prior to the establishment of poorhouses, the problem of what to do with paupers in a community was dealt with in one of three ways. The first way was called outdoor relief. Outdoor relief provided an overseer of the poor. When people fell upon hard times and members of their family, friends, or members of their church congregations could not provide enough assistance to tide them over, they applied to an elected local official called the overseer of the poor. Within a budget of tax money, he might provide them with food, fuel, clothing, or even permission to get medical treatment to be paid out of tax funds. The second way, they would actually auction off the poor. People who could not support themselves and their families were put up for bid in a public auction. In an unusual type of auction, the pauper was sold to the lowest bidder, the person who would agree to provide room and board for actually the lowest price. Usually this was for a specific period of time, a year or so. The person who got the contract got the use of the labor of the pauper for free in return for feeding, clothing, housing, and providing health care for the pauper and his or her family. This was actually a form of indentured servitude. Sounds a lot like slavery to me, except that it was technically not for the pauper's entire lifetime, although it had many of the perils of slavery. The welfare of the paupers depended almost entirely upon the kindness and the fairness of the bidder. If he was motivated only by a desire to make the maximum profit of the use of the pauper, then concern for the bottom line might result in the pauper being denied adequate food or safe and comfortable shelter or even necessary medical treatment. And there was often very little recourse for protection against such abuse. The third way was contracting with someone in the community to care for the paupers. In this situation, the care of a group of paupers was delegated to the person who would contract to provide care at, again, the lowest price. The system allowed the opportunity for somewhat better supervision as indicated in the term of the contract, which might specify what minimum standard of care must be provided and that the community officers would do inspections, etc. There were still often the same opportunities for abuse that were noted above. Note, in some cases, local communities had already discovered that a place to house paupers helped reduce the cost of poor relief. These small town poorhouses were the prototypes for the later state-required county poorhouses. Those earlier poorhouses often instituted the use of adjacent farms on which the paupers could work to raise their own food, thus making the houses self-sufficient and relying less on local tax funds. That's how the term poor farm came into being. During the second quarter of the 19th century, as the Industrial Revolution had its effect on the United States, the importation of the factory system from England was followed almost immediately by the full-scale adoption of the poorhouse system. These poorhouses were built with great optimism. They promised to be much more efficient and a cheaper way to provide relief to paupers. And there was a belief that housing such people in institutions would provide the opportunity to reform them and cure them of the bad habits and character defects that were assumed to be the cause of their poverty. By mid-century, people were beginning to question the success of the poorhouse movement. Investigations were launched to examine the conditions of poorhouses. They had proven to be much more expensive than had been anticipated, and they had not significantly reduced the number of poor, nor eliminated the need for outdoor relief for those who only needed short-term assistance. The Civil War was a major preoccupation of the American society during the third quarter of the century. Major systematic changes on welfare policy had to await calmer times. Ironically, the faltering poorhouse system was sheltered from the impact of the poverty produced by the war itself. The war created widows and orphans, and elderly people with no one to care for them. While many looked forward to a time when their sons and husbands would come home, many soldiers limped home to be disabled for the rest of their lives. However, a relatively small portion of these casualties of war ever actually wound up living in poorhouses, which goes to show you they were likely taken care of by family or, church members, etc. The veterans were spared this circumstance for two reasons. Special laws were passed requiring that any needed assistance to veterans and their families had to be provided as outdoor relief, specifically prohibiting placement in the poorhouses, and the Civil War pension plan provided for soldiers and their family members. In 1875, after the regulation of poorhouses in most states became the responsibility of the State Board of Charities, laws were passed prohibiting children from residing in poorhouses and removing mentally ill patients and others with special needs to more appropriate facilities. The poorhouse population was even more narrowly defined during the 20th century when social welfare legislation like workmen's compensation, unemployment benefits, and Social Security began to provide a safety net for people who would previously have been pauperized by such circumstances. Eventually, the poorhouses evolved almost exclusively into nursing homes for dependent elderly people. But poorhouses left orphanages, general hospitals, and mental hospitals for which they had been providing the prototype as their heritage. To delve into the poorhouse history a bit further and to give you an idea of how these poorhouses were used, let's talk about the Springfield, Missouri Poor Farm, opened in 1873. There were some newspaper articles that referenced this poorhouse. In 1887, it was written, an old German woman at the almshouse, which was another term for poorhouses, was inflicted with melancholy, a species of insanity, and refuses to eat. It is thought she will die of starvation. It's likely that this woman probably had Alzheimer's. Another article written in 1894 says, Dad Stevenson, the old circus clown who has been in a potable condition for several weeks as a result of too much whiskey, was taken to the poorhouse yesterday. James C. O'Rourke, who was attacked with a fit of insanity Tuesday night and threatened to kill his wife and child, was also taken to the county farm. Another article in 1894, a man of about 19 years of age named John Kinney, who was raised by Mrs. W.L. Chapman, has within the last 8 or 10 months lost his reason and is now a complete mental wreck. He has for some time been wandering around the neighborhood in the west part of the city, claiming that the property formerly owned by the estate of W.L. Chapman was his by right of inheritance. No attention was paid to his wild assertions until Sunday, when he became so obnoxious that the police were notified. To remove him to the poorhouse yesterday morning, it took the entire jail force to put him into chains. He fought like a tiger, but was finally overpowered and placed into a wagon and conveyed safely to the poor farm. During the struggle, he tried hard to bite his assailants, but was prevented from doing so. In 1895, Deputy Sheriff M.W. Hooper placed Henry Ray in the county poorhouse. Ray was a raving maniac, and the deputies had considerable trouble controlling him. Another article in 1895. De Groot, a well-known French rope performer, is in the Greene County poorhouse in critical condition. Sunday, the physicians took off his leg in order to save his life. De Groot goes around little towns where he gives exhibitions at county fairs and manages to pick up a few dollars. Last week, he appeared in Cave Spring and announced that he was going to make a leap for life. He stretched a wire across the street, got on top of the church steeple. It was his intention to jump from the top of the steeple to the wire, many feet below. He was going to catch the wire in his teeth. A big crowd assembled at Cave Spring to see the feat, and promptly, on time, De Groot got on top of the steeple and he jumped. He caught the wire all right, but it snapped in two. He fell to the ground and was badly bruised and injured in such a manner that his leg could not be saved and was taken off on Sunday. DeGroat is absolutely penniless and had to be taken to the poorhouse. He is doing well and will probably recover. When he does, he will still be in a hard luck as he can no longer continue his occupation. In 1899, Mrs. Honora Hughes died at the almshouse Monday night. The deceased was declared insane about a year ago and had been in the insane ward of the almshouse since that time. Another article in 1899 states Arthur Miller, about 14 years old, who lives with his stepfather, George Hoke, on the East Division Street Road, will be sent to the almshouse on the recommendation of Dr. J.E. Warden, who states that the boy is a subject of epileptic fits. Many reasons prompted people to be sent there, ranging from lack of resources to illegitimate pregnancies to physical illness. It was also a place where tuberculosis patients were sent, but as you research, you can see a good portion suffered from mental illness. When did mental illness begin being seen as a legitimate medical condition and not the fault of an individual? Into the 1940s and 50s, there was much about mental illness that society did not understand. They knew it was a problem, but the treatments for the time were downright barbaric. They did insulin shock, ice baths, they would tie them to chairs, cut a hole in the bottom of the chair, and just put a pot down there and leave them for days and days. They did sensory deprivation either in a dark dungeon like basements or put things over their heads so they could not see. People suffered from depression, which was not recognized as a legitimate mental health need, as well as schizophrenia, which is a mental disorder that causes people to interpret reality abnormally. They even thought people were demon-possessed. In 1890, the Springfield Leader newspaper sent a reporter to tour and share what he'd seen at the farm. The poorhouse is a rather cozy and home-like refuge for the afflicted, and it has a charm about it which the average alms-taker finds it difficult to withstand after the first experience, its comforts being far superior to those enjoyed by many families in moderate circumstances. It is therefore always crowded with inmates, and it is seldom that a vacancy occurs which is not filled at once by a successor. A man in one of the mad cells is chained to the floor by one ankle. He punches the air with his fists viciously, but refrains from hitting the wall. He is in a nude condition, refusing to wear any clothing. In another cell, the inmate keeps his bed rolled up and packed away in a corner. He sleeps on the bare floor without a pillow or covering. A little girl of about 3 years of age has a head so abnormally developed that she is top-heavy and already wears a number 7.5 hat. She is said to be phenomenally intelligent, and if she lives, she may develop a great talent in some avenue of thought. Fast forward 30 years to a newspaper article told of complaints against the poor farm from 2 husbands who claimed their wives were not well treated. In May, another article noted that the pastor of St. John's Episcopal Church, a parish and welfare worker of wide experience, was barred twice from being able to enter the facility and presumably see residents. It's unclear if conditions have improved, but a decade later, things were considered deplorable once again. An article in 1937 told of the terrible conditions of the facility. 1 bathtub for 30 men, bricks falling off the front of the building, 2 fire escapes for 135 residents, most of whom couldn't navigate the stairs anyway. The tumble-down, overcrowded, filthy fire trap, which serves Greene County as an almshouse where 135 men and women daily risk their lives simply by living, may be replaced with a modern building next year. There's no secret about conditions at the place where W.M. McDonald is superintendent. He's only too glad to show people through it because he's anxious as anyone to have the conditions corrected. More anxious probably because he'd be the one to hear the screams of the inmates who would be trapped in the rickety building should it catch fire. When you stand inside the front door, you find yourself looking down a corridor which runs the length of the building. The floor is concrete. At each side of the strip of concrete is a gutter about 6 inches deep and 6 inches wide. On either side of the corridor are rows of cells, the bars painted a lifeless gray. You're reminded of a dairy barn. 2 years later, an article announced that the work on the new facility was soon to start. This would be the final almshouse. It opened in August of 1941. The Poor Farm continued operations until it officially became Sunshine Acres Nursing Home in the mid-50s. At that time, it went from being managed by the county court to a board of citizen directors, and a number of remodeling projects were done. In 1957, an article noted that the residents paid $60 per month to live there, and other expenses were still subsidized by the county. But the transition to nursing